Along with our Science at the Sabha, which is an annual IMSC event. So we have a poster series that goes along with it, and then it kind of travels in Chennai for a year. After that, we make it available online. So this year, the poster series was actually some lunch table conversation at IMSC where someone was like, hey, but there's all this science about climate change, like we should try to communicate that. So that's kind of what this came out of. I worked, Shankar and I, sorry, volume's gone up. So Shankar, who many of you might know, he's a IMSC professor, now retired, physicist, who also works now in the field of climate change, specifically on glaciers. So he and I kind of curated it, and we picked out 12 different topics and asked contributors and reached out to different contributors all over the country, some even outside the country, to contribute, and then we kind of edited it and put it together. So maybe I'll just ask Shanks to tell us a few things of the topics and how we got here.
Good afternoon to all. Actually, when I started giving popular talks on this climate change, etc., around 2010, 15 years ago, there was a skepticism from all sections, undergraduate students to senior profs in earth sciences even. So people weren't convinced that it was a real thing. It was always seen as mixed up with politics, various conspiracy theories, etc., etc. But now I think that stage is over. Typically, people do seem convinced that climate change is real, and it is because of human activity. There are still holdouts, but by and large, this has become the establishment point of view, in my perception. So then there is, after that, two issues, mitigation and adaptation. Mitigation means what can you do to limit it? Limit the global warming and consequently climate change to the minimum possible. And as Jayaraman's abstract says, that has to be a global effort, and we'll hear more about that in the talk. Adaptation is, given that some amount of global warming and therefore climate change is inevitable, how do we adapt to it, adjust to it? Now that's a local issue because the effects are different in different places. Even the warming is more in the north, less in the equator. It changes place to place, the actual effect. So those are more local issues. This poster series mainly concentrates on them, not solely, but mainly on scientific studies in India or on different types of effects. It is not a comprehensive, coverage of all the impacts and this thing, but just to give some people some feel for what kind of, what is known by scientific work about the effects in India, in a few examples over there. So I think that is, and then there were some other posters, including some on mitigation. Some of these posters also, papers and therefore posters, suggested adaptation strategies. So both these things are going to become more and more important as we go along, and that's mainly what the poster series is about.
So since this is the first time sort of we're having a talk, I wanted a few other people also to kind of to come in. So we had Mani, who works at IMSC. So he, along with Uttara, did the translations. So maybe you can just tell us a little bit about how that worked.
So I'll just say a few words about the translation itself. And I think it is really important that these research findings are available in Tamil too, so that a larger set of people can be part of the climate change conversation. And so we are really glad that we have brought out these posters in Tamil. And I did the first drafts, but putting them together in easily understandable language would not have been possible without Uttara ma'am's support. So thanks to her. And also, I'd also like to thank Professors S. Krishnaswamy and R. Usha, who are not here today, they helped in vetting the translations. So thank you.
And finally, we worked with a very nice designer who helped us put it all together and make what the pretty posters that you see, that you saw from the text and like all these references and all these things, figures and plots that we had. So Radha is here. Maybe she can say a few things.
Hi. So I have a phone because I'm very scared of talking in public. So I feel like in general, like climate change broadly to me was like the shifting of patterns in weather and temperature. So I thought it would be fun for the title to do the same. So if you see the font of the title, there's a lot of like anomalies in the characters of the letters. So you'll find like an E that's a bit wonky. And so that was kind of the idea of that was just to throw you a little bit off whack and feel like it's not consistent. And then I also took some time to decide on a color palette that goes through the whole series. So like green for earth, light blue for wind, sort of royal blue for oceans, little red for like heat and temperature and stuff. And finally black to depict like contamination, pollution, decay, all that fun stuff. So, and then mainly like I feel like the imagery is kind of quite self-explanatory, like in terms of like the content, it was just reflections of the content that was in the poster. And it was quite content heavy, so it's fine, but it was really cool to interact and work in that space where there was so much research had gone into it and so much like specific, like being particular about certain things being there. So I thought it was very nice to work with that kind of thing. And I made sure that the background was like a little bit eroded and decayed. So you kind of feel like there's something disappearing or changing, shifting. But yeah, I was like so happy that Varuni asked me to help with this. So I like latched on like a parasite. But yeah, that's about it.
Thanks. So now so two of the posters were contributed by Jayaraman, who's our speaker today. So he's a senior fellow of climate change at the MS Swaminathan Research Foundation, so MSSRF, which is just the road next door. He's been working in climate policy and been actively associated with equity and climate justice. In fact, one of the posters that he contributed for this series was about equity. And he also works on the role these play in science policy interface in climate change. He was involved in the negotiations at the UNFCCC and IPCC on behalf of the government of India. And he's going to talk about some of that, I think, today. So he was actually at IMSC many years ago. And then after that was at the Tata Institute for Social Sciences, TIS in Mumbai. So now he's back here and he works with MSSRF. So over to you.
Okay. So the audio is okay? Right. Okay. Thank you, Varuni, Shankar, and others for this opportunity to talk again about issue that everybody ought to be concerned with, even if they are not. In some form, I think people are increasingly aware of it, though it varies across countries, it varies across the levels of development, it varies across which section of society one belongs to, many things like that, but that is always typical of global issues. But I think there is a lot of interest justifiably in this. But unfortunately, there's also a lot of, I wouldn't say misinformation, but information that is very incomplete, okay, for the most part. There is misinformation, of course, and active disinformation, but I think a lot of it is about missing gaps in information. So one of the things I feel is always, even when it looks a little boring and seems like you're talking about details, it's important to get some of this thing right. So the other day, someone with some experience in dealing with climate issues sent me a WhatsApp message saying, confusing the role of IPCC and the UNFCCC. And so it was unfortunate. It was amusing at first, but unfortunate because really it was a person one would have thought would know better. So things like that. So here it goes. So today I won't be talking about the IPCC, I won't be talking about the science as such, but I'll be talking about the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. Okay? So this is, of course, the United Nations body which is responsible for dealing with the problem of global warming. Now, there is a little bit of confusion. The UNFCCC, the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, refers in the first instance to the actual convention, an agreement which was signed now by more than 192 countries. It also refers to the implementation of the agreement as an ongoing process. So the UNFCCC is like a multilateral institution. So there is the treaty, the institution, and there is also its secretariat, which often is, the word secretariat is dropped, so they say the UNFCCC says, but it is not as if all the countries who are part of the UNFCCC are saying it, but it is the executive secretary who represents it who is saying it. So there are these different ways in which this is used. If you remember this, I think you can just follow it by context. So I won't get back to this in any detail. So global warming is what we call, it's a term coming from economics, but it is pretty straightforward, of what you call a global collective action problem. So global warming, we all know some idea, we have some idea what it is, due to carbon dioxide emissions or release of stored carbon in any form, including trees, peat, soils, etc., anywhere on the planet. When it is released, the stored carbon, you call it, this leads to global warming, and the primary source way and above of global warming is, which refers to the rise in the Earth's surface temperature, is due to carbon dioxide. There are other greenhouse gases, notably methane, nitrous oxide. There are this hydrofluorocarbons and other such gases. There are also some categories of aerosols. Some aerosols warm, some aerosols actually cool. So the warming aerosols, so there can be other reasons, but it is important to remember that way and ahead, the most important of these is carbon dioxide, and reducing carbon dioxide cannot be substituted by saying I'll reduce this first, then I'll get back to carbon dioxide. And that's kind of not correct, but I won't get that, go into that detail further. The real problem with carbon dioxide is that if you want to help the planet, if you stop emitting carbon dioxide or whatever is the source of such emissions, your action alone is not sufficient, because if somebody else is emitting carbon dioxide by whatever kind of activity, then that contributes to warming the planet as much as if, the fact that you are not doing it is not of much use. In fact, the world is very sharply divided among those who emit and a few who emit quite a lot, and a lot of people who emit quite a little. And so this adds to the problem. So it is what economists, as I said, call a collective action problem. It requires collective action by all, but there are costs involved. And these costs are also highly unequally distributed. There are some who have privilege but are unwilling to give it up. There are some who may have need or recourse to these emissions, who might have to undertake activity which leads to emissions. So, you know, if you tell them you have to cut emissions, then it doesn't work. So this makes for a complex problem. And of course, this is not as if we were dealing with the other major gas that we dealt with, which we have dealt with rather successfully, which is the release of chlorofluorocarbons that damage the ozone layer. That's its scope in human activity is very limited. There are only a few very specific activities where ozone layer damaging gases are released, and with a simple agreement relatively called the Montreal Protocol, this has been fairly successfully dealt with, and the consensus is that the ozone hole is not, the damage to the ozone layer is being repaired, is being set right. So it can be done. But the problem with fossil fuels is, as one American observer put it, it is the very life raft which has floated humanity in dealing with disaster. That very life raft is the source of your problems. Because it is industrial civilization that has contributed a great deal to our ability to resist the vagaries of weather. You know, nature you think of as bountiful, except when you are under an avalanche or a landslide, or you have a tsunami coming your way. You know, then of course nature is rather awesomely fearful. Earthquakes and tsunamis are about the scariest things you can see. So, you know, nature is not quite as benevolent as you think all the time. And in a pre-industrial era, humanity was exposed to the vagaries of weather, as still a part of the world's population is. So, obviously, you know, there is this industrial civilization which has, the era of industrialization, which has helped us face the vagaries of nature, enabled well-being on a mass scale through productive activities, etc. This is the very origin of what is currently our challenge. So, this is very different from what happens with pollution in the general sense, or even issues like the ozone layer. So, just I took some time over this, but I think it's important to get this right. So, there's a small definition I put here of what a collective action problem is, but that's not very complicated. So, by 1992, it was clear that the world had to do something about this problem. The United States, which was in the lead, in one of the countries which took the lead in its action, was also where there was a substantial amount of skepticism, but nevertheless, it was their cooperation which moved the world forward. They had an important role. But all other countries were also very deeply concerned. So, following a UN General Assembly resolution, over a period of 2 to 3 years, there were intense negotiations. The IPCC was formed, and eventually there is a treaty, an agreement on climate change which was required, which was negotiated over 2.5 years. It's very interesting to go back and dig that history. And there was clearly by the Rio summit at 1992, a document contested, lot of difficult negotiations, but nevertheless successfully we had a this framework convention on climate change. So it was a very forward-looking agenda, integrated other UN principles, and it had so what one must say, ethically very positive attitude. Sometimes in moments I think that if we had to negotiate such a treaty from scratch today, we would not succeed. You know, it was an extraordinary conjuncture that it happened in 92, and in India and many other countries across the global south, including the big ones like China or others, including all the Middle East, including Latin America, across the world, I think there is great support for the fundamental principles of the UNFCCC. What are some of its key elements? And this is, I think, now that we are in the era of actually doing something about climate change, I think it's very important to look at these principles. They are not to be dismissed. I think they hold a place alongside the Declaration of Human Rights and Social and Economic Rights. Dealing with this global challenge is, I think, these principles are foundationally important. So, equity and the principle of common but differentiated responsibilities and respective capabilities, the convention states, I'll call it the convention, the UNFCCC in short, the climate convention states, is the basis of action to protect the climate system. Now, you know, this has become, especially unfortunately in some environmental circles, something people sneer at, and I think this is absolutely misplaced. And this is the first point I want to drive home. Okay? There is no way that we can have a world where you take some kind of neo-Malthusian attitude of, you know, the poor can look out for themselves. If they suffer, some people will suffer. You have to protect the climate. This is environment. And somehow you pose the question as one of environment versus people, environment versus society. In which case, of course, it becomes very problematic. The whole point about sustainable development, and is very clear even from the Brundtland Commission report and all of that, that the harmony of environment and development is the real challenge. Otherwise, sustainable development has no challenge whatsoever inside it. You know, you choose one or the other and we fight over it. So these principles are very important, and it is not replaced by this popular phrase called national circumstances. See, the wording is very precise. Common but differentiated responsibility. It is not simply differentiated, it is common, but common does not mean everybody does everything identically. So this is what you would call a term of some quite significant, some significance in international law, and it will be very interesting since there is a reference from the UN on climate change to the International Court of Justice, what kind of judgment and decision we'll get on this. This is something to look out for. It also says that developed countries ought to take the lead in climate action. There is acknowledgement that some countries are disproportionately, the rich countries of the world, the developed countries are disproportionately responsible for both the past and current emissions, and there is reference to it in the preamble. It also says that developed countries should provide the means of implementation, as they are called in UN language, which refers to climate finance, technology transfer, and support for capacity building. Capacity meaning in a variety of ways, could be knowledge, organizational, technical skills, etc. And this climate finance in particular is not to substitute over, developmental assistance, which was already in place at the time the treaty was signed. It was to be new and additional. It was not to be simply from private sources, because private sources would look for return on investment, and many of the actions to with regard to climate change may not be those which will fetch financial returns. If you want to protect coastal communities, it's not obvious that a company can stand to make profits from it, or if they did, then the communities perhaps end up being worse off than they were earlier. So I think it's public sources of climate finance was very important, and the fact that concessional loans and grants, and this is not a means by which new indebtedness is created for developing countries. Also, the importance of adaptation in balance with mitigation is not simply everybody reduces the emissions and whatever is the consequence, people have to lump it, so to speak, So adaptation is as much a responsibility as anything else. So the whole ball game about this, and I think if you go back and read it, and I really urge all of you to find the occasion to read this text. When you read it, you see that there is, it's really the way it is crafted is very valuable, and I think it's a valuable resource for humanity. And India, I must say, played a excellent role in, a leading role in the formulation of this principles of the UNFCCC. There are very interesting accounts by particularly the late Chandrasekhar Dasgupta, who was a senior foreign affairs official in our ministry, who took a lead role in these negotiations. Also, Mr. Nitin Desai, who served a long time in the United Nations organization at that time. So after this, the name of the game has been the implementation of the UNFCCC. So I think the point I want to emphasize before I move forward is that a treaty of this kind is essential. So the UNFCCC is not something dreamed up by a bunch of lawyers or a bunch of political figures, is not some conspiracy of Shell or Exxon or whoever it is. It is something that we need because it is a collective action problem, and there is no way that a world can solve the problem without dealing with this. And all this sort of vague talk you hear that, recently I was very surprised. They should have known better. Some IPCC scientists gave an interview to The Guardian where they said that, the scientists, a group of scientists should have a veto power over the policies of governments. Governments should declare the policies, and the scientists should vet them and say yes or no, whether it's okay or not. I think I haven't heard of a more absurd suggestion, frankly. No stakeholder, or as they call it, or no individual section can have that claim. And it is up to the collective wisdom of humanity, and it cannot be. How did we manage this? Help. Slideshow again? Oh, maybe. Yes, I pressed something. So I think I found this an extraordinarily, weird suggestion, because it's simply impossible that something that involves the entire world, that it goes to the foundation of our modern industrial activity, the way we conceive of the world, etc., that that you take recourse to some such this thing. And also this idea somehow that you need some benign, benevolent authoritarian rule that will then dictate to the rest of the world is another absurd option. There are talk, for instance, Brazil, for instance, has a genuine problem with dealing with the Amazon, to control deforestation in the Amazon, which adds to emissions and global warming. And of course, you had a president of Brazil who said he doesn't care about global warming. They have just elected a similar personality as president of Argentina. So the various countries have political leaders who have their own opinions in the matter. But there were extraordinary suggestions, including from political circles, that countries should take diplomatic or some economic action, like sanctions, against countries like Brazil. That kind of thing will not work. So I think the convention as the forum, the other great temptation that you see today, and this is also problematic, is, for instance, to say there are other forums, maybe we can. This is the UNFCCC, nothing is getting done, we must do something urgently. So let the G7 decide, which is the guys who are responsible for the problem in the first place, as I'll just mention in a bit. Or the other thing is the G20 should take the lead. It's one thing to say that those who have the capacity should put their heads together and see if they can do more. Nobody could quarrel with that. But somehow this idea that a small climate club, as they call it, which constitutes 75% of emissions, if they go ahead and take action, we'll solve the problem. I think this kind of undemocratic solutions are destined to fail. And we have seen repeatedly in political and economic matters that when you thrust such solutions down people's throats or the throats of other countries, they don't work. So let me move on. So it has been a long story of getting this actual implementation. And unfortunately, the story has been that, as always, once it became clear after the initial enthusiasm of signing the treaty that you would have all countries doing equally rather than equitably their share of climate action, it became a question of how developed countries would then get developing countries on board. Now, this story doesn't begin with the UNFCCC, and this is what I want to emphasize. It has a long history, and the first example of this was the story of what is called limits to growth. There's a famous study that appeared early in 1970, and it says quite openly, I mean there's no ifs and buts about it. It says very clearly that the developed countries have gotten rich, and it was sponsored by the OECD, which is the Rich Guys Club, though there are a couple of poor cousins on its rolls, but that's a separate story. But so there are this club, so they are all developed using, their wealth depends on the use of natural resources. But what will happen if China and India get into the act? And that whole study begins with that premise. When the rest of the world seek the same kind of standards of living, can the world take it? Now, of course, there is a tendency for if you wish, in our culture, in many other cultures, of being abstemious, being frugal, being ascetic even, not, being full of worldly goods. It's there in all cultures and ways of thinking in one way or the other. But this cannot become economic policy. So it's one thing to quote Gandhiji as that, the world has enough to satisfy everyone's needs, but not everyone's greed. Now, that's fine as a moral goal, but that cannot dictate exactly how economic policy works. So, this long story, therefore, continued with the UNFCCC despite its excellent foundational principles of diluting differentiation, the difference between rich and poor, between developed and developing, and the provision of means of implementation, which simply did not happen. So one of the landmarks in this was Copenhagen, and till Copenhagen in 2009, from 1992, 17 years, it had always been thought that the developed countries would take upon themselves some binding quotas of what they should do, some target for which they were responsible. That was finally given up in Copenhagen. So they said everybody will promise what is possible, what they think they can do, and what they are liable for is its implementation of their promise. But what they promise is not framed by anyone else except voluntarily. Now, of course, that's something which remains and haunts us to this day. So then the other thing was, of course, after 17 years, finally they put up this figure of what kind of financial assistance would be possible. The famous figure of providing $100 billion US annually by 2020 for climate change. So of course we are in 2024. Nothing of the sort has happened. There is even an argument over whether it is 100 billion. So of course it's not 100 billion. The OECD claims it's now close to 89. Every year Oxfam has a report, and the latest Oxfam report said something like in the low 30s, 32, 33, whatever. So obviously this money is not coming. So then, after Copenhagen, after the voluntary thing, there was a fresh push by a group of countries, including the European Union, the African countries, etc., at Durban in 2011. And there the goal was to sign an agreement which would be legally binding on all. And the original idea was this legally binding agreement would be targets for all. And of course, countries like India were very nervous about it, etc. But what turned out, of course, was something quite different. So the voluntary pledges regime that began in Copenhagen was solidified. Legally binding commitments on none. So you just promise what you will do. They introduced the phrase national circumstances, which was a real dilution of the principle of common but differentiated responsibilities. So the developed countries said, we have no responsibility for what we have used of emissions in the past, what we have contributed to warming. Though, of course, developing countries don't allow them to forget it. All the global south countries. So there was a various ways in which the responsibility of the rich of the world to provide for the whole world as a collective to deal with this problem, this whole perspective continued to be diluted. So post-2020, let me not dwell further on the details. Of course, one of the problems was that despite the fact that we had already reached 20 years past the climate convention being signed, the United States remains, for instance, in a situation where it goes in and out of climate agreements. The United States was party to the final form of what was called the Kyoto Protocol, signed in 1997. And then the United States, everybody went home, Al Gore went home, and then the US Senate told him, we are not going to ratify this. And across the board, not just one side, Democrats and Republicans together, 92 or 98 too, it was something like that. So that was one thing. So then afterwards, when it came to Copenhagen, etc., when it seemed that everybody, there would be something binding, then under Obama, the US seemed to be back in the action. But no sooner than the ink was dry, so to speak, on the Paris Agreement, that was the end of that. Mr. Trump was elected. And so that rained on Obama's parade. He thought he would have a grand farewell on the global stage with the passage of the Paris Agreement, but that was not to happen. So I think this, now you may argue, so can we ignore the United States? There's no way you can ignore the United States in the problem of global warming. Does it mean the fact that they are not, as the richest country, the most technologically capable country, the most powerful country in terms of trade, finance, and wealth, and the kind of industrial resources they can command, the refusal to take the lead, does it hurt the world? It hurts the world. But there is, unfortunately, no real shortcut to getting the United States on board. And this is you may ask, why do you emphasize the United States and why not China? And that's the, so I'll just come to that in a minute. So let me skip this. So see, so far when you have looking at the story that we have said so far, you know, it all seems you must cut emissions, I must cut emissions, who is to cut emissions? But what is a benchmark of how to cut emissions? So the one thing you have to remember is carbon dioxide is not simply pollution. You need emissions until you can have the technologies ready across a number of human activities, or you can rearrange the way we do things in society so that we can bring emissions down to virtually zero. At some point, it has to become zero. That's what people talk about vaguely as net zero. I'll explain it a little more precisely. So then, you know, but how do we get there? So the reason is, for instance, take a very simple, it's not rocket science. So for instance, in a country like India, we need houses. We desperately need houses. We have about 40%, 50%, I don't know the latest figure, of people who have Pakka housing. And what we call Pakka housing has its own issues in terms of quality. So reasonable, whatever reasonable is, quality housing requires immediate action. But immediate action will unfortunately involve the use of cement, bricks or whatever, and that will lead to emissions. So there are emissions which are necessary. Can we shift all our agriculture to something that creates no emissions? This is something that none of the developed countries are able to do, even though the scientific input into their agriculture is at an incredibly much better level. So can we do it in a country like India? Obviously, it's going to be very difficult. So we need time. So how do we allocate the responsibility of how much you can emit? And so one of the ways to do it, and I think this is, has very strong support in science, is that if you have a target for how much temperature increase the world can tolerate, the total emissions, the cumulative emissions from pre-industrial period, when really we started using coal in a big way, till the time emissions stop, this cumulative emissions is the indicator. So you can say that if you emit at 1 trillion tons of carbon dioxide, then the average temperature of the earth goes up by 0.45 degrees centigrade. Okay? This is the thumb rule. So the world, so to speak, has a carbon budget. Now you have to put methane, etc. into this story. That's a matter of a little bit of detail. That's for another occasion. So you can see that we have these carbon budgets for 1.5 degrees and 2 degrees. Okay? And the issue is that a lot of it is completely used up. So for instance, if you look at the, if you look at it here, you see that for 1.5 degrees temperature increase, 4/5 of the carbon budget is already gone. And of course, we still have, the extent of the needs that are around in society. Of course, there is a different question. We build houses today, 30 years later, how do we renew them or build them again? How will we do that? That's a question for the future for which we don't have an answer. But you can't say therefore we won't do anything. But at the same time, so we need to get houses built, or we need to provide sanitation, we need to provide health. So all of this, which we call quote unquote development, and whereby people's employment and livelihoods, for which we require industrial activities of some kind, all of this, those who are still to attain adequate levels of development have to make do within this 500 gigatons, billion tons of carbon dioxide they can emit, along with the rich who continue to emit a lot of carbon dioxide. So that's the problem. So similarly, if you have a limit of 2 degrees centigrade, then you have a little more headroom, but this staying within the carbon budget. And because this carbon budget is a finite resource, it is clear that a global finite resource should be shared equitably. And this is something which has been recognized in the United Nations framework in other contexts, like the law of the sea, etc. So here you have, what do you mean equitable? So a rough indicator you can start with, you can tweak it a little, is your share of the global population. So the Annex 1 is a term from the convention referring to the developed countries. So they constituted in 2019 19% of the global population, and they had emitted from 1850 68% of cumulative emissions. Whereas you take the global south, which is 81% of the world, then you had the non-Annex 1 who had emitted 32%. Actually, that includes China. So China is 18% of the world, and here I think they alone contribute about 12%. So that's the situation we have. And that's why development is a serious concern. So these are some more clear numbers about this. I'll share this PowerPoint, so if people want access to the numbers later, it'll be fine. Now, in fact, it is not, see, the term developed countries, because of when the convention was signed, is actually includes the former Soviet bloc, Russia, Eastern European countries, etc. So if you start with what are called the OECD countries, okay, and you take out those who were earlier in the Soviet bloc, then actually they have done very little. And in fact, this is without developed emitted 47%. Since the convention was signed, of which the OECD alone has contributed 37%, and the percentage of the population is less than 15%. So that's the kind of inequality in emissions. So you can see that here is, look at China. China in post-91, of course, its emissions have been very high, but if you look at the overall picture, they also fall behind their population share. India, we have emitted much less than our share. So all this, there are all these people who tell you, oh, India must do something about climate change, etc. We are not doing it. What are we up to, etc. So in that context, there is this sort of, I may say, inverse hubris. You might think, oh, India is the third largest emitter in the world. India by no means is third largest emitter. If the per capita emissions of India were the per capita emissions of the world as a whole, then the world would have no climate problem at all. All of it would be absorbed by the world's vegetation. Okay? So, in fact, this is not something, however, to always pat oneself on the back about. It's also our lack of industrial development, our lack of manufacturing, our substantial remaining burden of low incomes and relative poverty. So, all of that taken into account, but nevertheless, we are not the ones responsible for the problem, and equally, our contribution to reducing emissions is not the decisive part of the global story. We can contribute, but we are not decisive, and this is very important. So this whole story of, therefore, when you should get to net zero, but the point is that you should get to net zero in a manner that you don't consume more of the carbon budget than is your fair share. Okay? And most of the countries, the rich countries, their promises of when they will reach zero emissions simply allows them to grab continually even more of the global carbon budget as they have been doing in the past. So you can monetize this if you want, and the figure comes out in really trillions of dollars, even at some modest value of what this is, putting a value to this extra share of the carbon budget that they have taken. So let me skip all of this. So actually this is their actual performance. So given what they were supposed to have done, according to the AR4 refers to the fourth assessment report of the IPCC, and then you have this two ranges were given. This is the actual reduction until 2080, and you can look at the various bumps. So all of these new agreements that were made were occasions where there was a lot of rhetoric, there was all this thing about this thing, and even as you reach 2020, we have the UN Secretary General telling us of global boiling, and the 1.5 must be kept within reach, and Mr. Alok Sharma, the COP26 president in UK, was almost in tears when we said we can't do without coal, and so on and so forth. But despite all the drama that we see and the rhetoric, this is unfortunately the reality. So having provided this background, I do not have too much time to talk about COP28. I'll just hit the highlights. But let me make a point which is, I think there is increasing resonance in popular media about this, which I really think that is very important for us to confront. So one of the issues is, in the UNFCCC, how do you take a decision? There are two ways to take a decision. A decision meaning which is a strong decision which says countries must do something. In UN language, when you say parties, parties refer to countries, parties to the agreement, parties shall do something, that is the strongest language. Then you have should, then you have may, then you have urged to do, then you have considered. So there are various levels of compulsion, if you wish, okay, in the agreement. So shall appears very rarely, and that is because genuinely there is a problem. So the all parties, so why does that happen? Because it has to be by consensus. And consensus means all parties. And this means as every single country, irrespective of its size, its clout, or whatever you have, has a right to say, no, I do not agree. So a lot of this is, now people are saying that, of course, you know, how can we accept this? But in an interlinked world, this is the only guarantee. That we have a world which may be environmentally safe, but if we need a world that is also politically secure, developmentally secure, there is no way that we can breach this caveat. So if there are differences and we are unable to reach a consensus, these differences are real. These differences are not artificial. These differences are real. They are real politic, they are real in the economic sense, and as I have been sort of showing you from the data that you see and other kinds of information, this is the reality of a world dominated by a few of the wealthy and a large majority who are not in that category. So we have, for instance, you can forget about countries, you just look at population income-wise distribution, you will find that the bottom 50% of all emitters, which constitute some 13 to 15% of the global population, bottom 50, whose emissions are 13 to 15%, and their average income is, for the most part less than $3 US per day. So these people have no responsibility. So nevertheless are also in need of development, okay? So including the fulfilling of basic necessities. So of course there are two ways. Agreement is rare and it is very heavily argued, and on the other hand the option, a cop-out as you might call it, is to have weak language which is non-binding. But this reflects something real, and substituting it by any kind of majoritarian this thing is, I think, profoundly inequitable and eventually will not work. In the event, you can be sure that if you look at the veto record of the Security Council, you will know who are the people who do not most frequently adhere to global consensus. So this was the background of COP28. So if you don't get this picture, then unfortunately COP28 becomes just a lot of words which are flying around. So of course the formal agenda of COP28 was primarily the review of the functioning of the Paris Agreement. There were other items on the agenda, all geared towards in some way implementing the Paris Agreement based on previous decisions. But the so-called global stocktake was the key centerpiece of COP28. The other thing, of course, is continuing negotiations on finance, because without climate finance, developing countries simply cannot get where they have to. And the final thing, which of course is a constant preoccupation of the developed countries, is the agenda of carbon trading. So when the United States makes a promise, for instance, saying that it will cut its emissions, etc., all of this is predicated on achieving it through market means. So sometimes, from a country like India, we do not read the signals correctly. When they say that we are going to achieve this target, it's all based on how they have modeled it, how they think they will pass a set of laws, etc., which will make sure it will happen, or mechanisms to facilitate the working of markets. It is all market driven. So for instance, I'll just come to that. So carbon trading is big on their agenda. So one of the things that the COP28 presidency, every conference of parties, which is a COP, the conference of parties. The conference of parties is the annual meeting of the UNFCCC, where discussions are held, decisions are taken, and efforts made to move climate action forward. So one of the big agenda items they had was this: keeping 1.5 degree goal alive or within reach. Unfortunately, there was nothing. The carbon budget is being swallowed at a rate that by 2030-31 we are going to finish the budget. So whether that year or later, or back and forth a few years, when we will cross the 1.5 degree limit is not clear, but we will eventually, the way things are going. The other was rapid emissions reduction, including global peaking, and 43% of reduction of emissions below 2020 levels by 2030, and what they call a just, orderly and equitable energy transition, of which one of the highlights was the tripling of the world's renewable energy capacity. Okay? Now, that is a very interesting one, because India, for instance, from 2022 levels, they said. So for India, we understand what that means, because we have a clear target, which is 500 gigawatts by 2030 of renewable energy. It is solar, wind, larger hydro, mini hydro are included. Okay? So by that criteria, we have set 500. What is the US target? What is the EU target? There is no target. So they have not announced a target, but they were at the forefront of encouraging the presidency of COP28, namely the United Arab Emirates, and there was Sultan Al Jaber, who was very vocal COP president that we have seen in recent times. So they were very active in encouraging this resolution to be passed. However, it's not as if, so it was a general sort of target for the world, in which the rich guys are not saying what is going to be their share. So it's as obvious as that. And in fact, I would have liked a situation where all the global south got together and said, very good, but we will sign this, we will get on board with this, provided you declare your share. Now, of course, that does not happen, because then they'll say you're blocking an agreement. So some agreement is better than none, so it looks bad in the global media. So these things don't happen. So here, tripling of global RE capacity, doubling the reduction. So the other big ticket item was reduction in global emissions by 43% by 2030. Where does this come from? Unfortunately, this comes from modeling efforts. This comes from a whole lot of scientific literature, which unfortunately simply does not take equity or the concerns of poor countries into account. So these is one of the most serious issues here, that very fundamental principles of what is called mainstream economic theory are the real source of this kind of outcomes that you get. So one of them, for instance, is Pareto optimality. It's a very well-known criteria in economics when you say how to optimize welfare or something like that. But Pareto optimality means that nobody should be worse off than they were before. But that means that those who are rich cannot get poorer. So Pareto optimality simply does not allow for distributive justice. So there's a whole lot of such assumptions that go into the making of these targets. So this target is stated in general terms, and thanks to the push and pull of developing countries, you see a little caveat. Well, let me skip these. Let me skip all this. Numbers. So you see what I have underlined, based on global model pathways and assumptions. So this is a little indicator which the developing countries, after a lot of argument, managed to put in there, saying that these numbers are not really coming from any equitable solution to the problem of climate change. So unfortunately, one of the problems with dealing with the climate change problem is that even the scientific literature, scientific not in the strictly physical science sense, but social science, economics, etc. included, the scientific literature does not follow the principles of the UNFCCC. So you are hard put to find solutions that promote equity in a clear way. So of course, this is something that I have worked on with my colleagues. That's so Pareto optimality, I thought, could always be a nice way to describe this is like this. You know, a quotation from the Gospel by Saint Matthew, where he says, "For to everyone who has, more will be given, and he will have abundance. But from him who does not have, even what he has will be taken away." So that's a good description of how a lot of so-called scientific literature on mitigation from the global north works. So this is that famous paragraph from COP28, okay, which said, everybody said that it is not enough, but at least it is something. And this para 28, you can see illustrated some of the issues that I have been raising. It says calls on parties. So it does not say parties shall. So obviously everybody is up in arms saying this is very weak, but this is the best that one can agree on. So they say in a nationally determined manner. You don't see the term common but differentiated responsibilities and equity over here, but it has appeared earlier in the text. And a considerable amount of negotiations actually went on to preserving that fundamental principle in the text of the final decision. So then here they talk about nationally determined manner, taking into account the Paris Agreement and their different national circumstances, pathways and approaches. So within that, with all those caveats, one sort of says that you must triple renewable energy capacity globally, double the global average annual rate of energy efficiency improvement, accelerate efforts towards the phase down of unabated coal power. This, of course, they single out coal without talking about oil and gas. That lets a whole bunch of the rich countries off the hook because they don't depend on coal but depend on oil and gas. Then here, accelerating efforts globally towards net zero emission energy systems. This is not energy system, refers to just about everything. Okay, so this is quite a comprehensive statement, but unfortunately utilizing zero and low carbon fuels. So low carbon fuels is again an exit for those using oil and gas. But the point in relation to the carbon budget story I told you earlier was that it doesn't matter if it is oil or gas. It's all the carbon dioxide you emit from whatever source should not cross that limit. One good thing is transitioning away from fossil fuels is included. So in that sense, oil and gas have now become part of the story, though they have not been named. And so as to achieve net zero by 2050. But net zero by 2050, if this means that the rich countries will also reach net zero by 2050, means that we will not have 1.5 inland. We will cross 1.5 for sure. Okay? So this is what this para is about. And here is this, this is the stamp of the presence of the United States in these negotiations. They have this methane obsession of theirs, and they have this idea, which is actually profoundly scientifically incorrect, that somehow, since methane is short-lived, but a potent greenhouse gas, it decays in the atmosphere, and it, after 12 years, half the methane is lost. Whereas carbon dioxide simply hangs around, for 1,000 years at least. So one of the ways, one of their arguments is, let us try and cut all the methane we can right away, and then we can take our time over cutting the carbon dioxide. Now that is simply profoundly incorrect, scientifically incorrect, but nevertheless you can't stop them. So there that comes. And then of course they are always after subsidies. But in India, as a matter of fact, there is some sense that India is one of the countries where there is a lot of fossil fuel subsidy. Nothing of the sort. We have some of the highest energy costs in the world, especially in terms of what common people pay. So this is what eventually we got out of this sort of the crux of the outcomes of COP28. But like I said, understanding this, figuring out what this means that you have to pay attention to some of the issues that I had spent a lot of time discussing prior to it. So one of the positive decisions from the COP28 was the passage of what is referred to as the global goal on adaptation. I have referred to as GGA, my bad. So global goal on adaptation is a very important step. The adaptation aspect has always been the neglected part of activities at the UNFCCC, and the developed countries create a lot of talk around it, but very little action. So here is something quite concrete which developed countries worked on very actively. And then, of course, another issue is there were other issues about trade and putting carbon tariffs for depending on if you are producing goods which have greater emissions footprint, then the European Union says we will tax you more, or we'll put barriers to the import of your this thing. So barriers of that kind which violate equity and so on and so forth. So these were all the decisions, but what you have to see is the overall framework in which these discussions happen. So let me stop here, and I've gone on quite a bit, so thank you.
So we have time for a few questions, and I think people are watching on YouTube. If you want to put comments in, we'll try to take those as well as questions.
So are you optimistic?
I think, let me answer that seriously. I think there are two levels to answering that. One is a scientific level. And I think I am profoundly in opposition to the increasingly strident alarmism that marks the scientific discourse from the global north. Johann Rockström is the rock star leading the whole story. Planetary boundaries, the eat Lancet diet, he's everywhere. And you know, the melting of the West Antarctica ice sheet, tipping points. But the problem is twofold. And we know language that goes with it. They talk of hard and soft limits to adaptation. So then what do? You give up your hands? You say people will drown? So, you know, there is this whole way, this framing of the discourse of adaptation and also mitigation, etc., which either you do it my way or this is it. So I think there is something profoundly problematic about it. And I say this seriously with all the experience also that we have had in the UN IPCC negotiations. And India has taken a formal position against calling for balanced scientific judgments, especially taking note of the uncertainties in our estimates. Uncertainties are not merely, oh my God, precautionary principle, look for the maximum impact. No, it's also uncertainties are opportunities to exploring what are other options, and maybe, you know, things can be managed. That's number one. The second is political and social, and I think that comes from, you know, we have this entire history. If you look at the what Professor Swaminathan would often refer to, this Paul Ehrlich's population bomb. And he would refer to it as, in very polite terms, as very incorrect book, but it's a profoundly, somebody else called it a racist text. So this whole attitude that the triage mentality, you know, that who can survive? We have to decide whether the world can survive. This whole attitude, and it includes ecosystems versus people, you know, all kinds of things. The pervasiveness of this attitude is something you have to see to be believed. For instance, when they do all this modeling, how the world will do mitigation, etc., It's very interesting that they group the world into 10 regions, quote unquote. Okay? Because you cannot have a model with 192 countries with all its details. There's not even enough data. So you club the whole thing together. Only OECD countries are treated as countries, as a group. Everybody else is treated geographically, you know, and they are by Southeast Asia, South Asia, Middle East, and North Africa, etc. So, to a lot of the scientific perspective in this comes with the idea that only the OECD are the economies and the rest of us are all geographies. So, we have to redo this, and it is urgent. But it is without redoing the way we think about this problem, we just simply going to stampede and panic like everybody else. Politically, yes, I think the point that we have is, yes, climate action is slow. Our capacities are only what they are. We should be realistic. Our footprint, as I showed you, is minimal. India has contributed less than 4% to global cumulative emissions from 1850 to 2020. And our contribution post 1990 does not show any dramatic increase. It's only about 6% of cumulative emissions, or less. I have to look at the exact number. So the point is, therefore, that we should focus on development. I think the message, I didn't have time to go through the slide, but maybe it is here. For India, as I say, India's developmental agenda has never been more significant or urgent. So I think this is our starting point. Optimism, pessimism, I think I don't see how I can think in those categories. Would you have been optimistic in the face of the Great Bengal famine? In the face of the Victorian famines, was there room for optimism? But we got here to 2024, right? So I think the discourse of the global north in this respect is something we have to set aside. And I can't think of intellectually anything more urgent in the issue of climate change. Yeah.
Sort of related, just one more thing. So nationally, is there anything that the discourse can actually change in any effective way? And does it even make sense to try to do that? I mean, would it, at the national level?
See, the discourse is unfortunately a little confused by conflating the environmental issues with the climate change problem. So recently there was this objection to protest this note about green credits in regard to forests. Okay, now that is an issue with regard to forests and compensatory use of forests. You can cut forests here, you can replace it there, will you get credits, etc. This kind of issue, yes, there is an issue there that has to be discussed. But you know, this constant attempt to say this is climate change, okay, that is a problem. But if you think, if you remove this kind of unnecessary confusion with environmental issues versus the climate change problem per se, broadly India's trajectory, irrespective of the government we have had earlier or this present dispensation which has been there for the last decade, the basics are very clear. We have a developmental agenda. There is no way we can buck that developmental agenda. In fact, if anything, we should focus more on it. But on the other hand, we do not have denialism. In fact, I am more concerned in the domestic agenda about this competitive declaration of net zero. The government of India said 2070, and there is a whole bunch of state governments and departments within the center and state governments who declare their own net zero, okay, date of achieving. So Chennai net zero by 2050. I mean, with great respect, I submit that they don't know what they are talking about. It's not clear what net zero New York by 2050 means. So how is net zero Chennai? And the documents are produced, of course, with in a very well-meant way, and you see a line of which is graph of emissions from Chennai, and it goes flat from 2020 to 2040 or something, and gently goes down to 2050. That's just something just cooked up, you know. So you have no idea. So and somehow I must say I was quite surprised after COP26, after a declaration of 2070 as net zero by the Prime Minister, that Parliament had a debate on the net zero, and on both sides of the House there was concern about our trajectory to net zero. Okay? Unfortunately, we have never had a discussion on Parliament on a trajectory to net zero malnutrition, or zero malnutrition, or near zero maternal mortality, or infant mortality, or zero stunting. So I think if you look at a lot of initiatives that the central government budget is undertaking, a lot of it is going to mitigation and not enough into development and adaptation. So I think that is where the discourse has to be shifted, and it is not inadequate climate action as some of our friends would have it. That's, I believe, the necessary discourse in India. Of course, the discourse in the United States is going to be completely different, and the discourse in the European Union has to be different. We are at different levels of development. That's my answer to it.
Questions from YouTube?
Why is the unit of carbon budget nation states? Because it doesn't matter whether you live in India, like people in this building, for instance, like there's a class difference and not necessarily one demarcated by national boundaries, right?
It is demarcated by national boundaries because in essence, carbon, see, first of all, there are two levels, okay. One is the unit of economic activity, okay, where interconnectedness is relatively less and interconnected is more, is the natural boundary is the nation state, number one. Okay? And you can see that by a number of ways. If you look at, say, of course, people say globalization, the earth is flat, etc. But hype aside, you can talk of national economies, and they are well defined. Within that, regions are more complex to deal with. So the nation state is the natural boundary of economic activity. So the nation state is therefore the natural boundary of emissions. So if you want to account for who produces fossil fuels but who actually uses them, that can be done. And it is not as if that completely changes the picture. Okay? It adds a little bit. China's emissions look a little less than they were if they were simply, if you removed their consumption part. The US emissions look little more if you included their consumption. But it is not as if the picture is completely overturned. So national boundaries do make sense. The second thing is that of responsibility. So if you have the United Nations, the shell is not a party in the United Nations. The world is organized on the basis of nation states. So we do account for the role of non-party stakeholders. This is the buzzword that is used sometimes in a good way, sometimes it is just a cover-up. When non-party stakeholders is Shell or IBM or people like that, then non-party stakeholders is a cover-up. Non-party stakeholder arena is also even more inequitable. In the UNFCCC, in the COP, they always, this is this big thing about the formal negotiations and the informal part, where informal part is all by non-party stakeholders. But it's a field which is not level but tilted like this. If you are a prominent, wealthy international NGO, you can get there. If you are a small organization somewhere in Chennai, you don't get there. So eventually when you talk of responsibility, who is responsible for cutting emissions? Responsibility can only be with nation states. We do not, we cannot even have a multilateral investment agreement. We cannot discipline multinationals for pollution or any such thing without going through the nation state. So there is no way we are going to deal with the UNFCCC without the nation state. So for the carbon budget also, this is the natural unit, okay? Cumulative emissions, etc.
So I think we've gone a bit over already. So
Yeah.
there's tea and snacks outside, so we can continue some of these conversations. But thank you, gentlemen, for starting us off on this.
Yep.
And
Thank you.
just to let everyone know, the poster series will be on view for another week or so. It's the second floor of